America is facing a dangerous trend, a trend that threatens the very fabric of our society and the principles upon which this nation was built. Left-wing violence is on the rise, manifesting in ways that are both alarming and unprecedented. Its targets are not just political figures or public institutions, but everyday Americans who are simply going about their lives. We see it in the attacks on Tesla owners, targeted simply for driving cars produced by a company associated with Elon Musk. These vehicles, symbols of innovation and progress, have become unintended battlegrounds in a larger cultural war. These aren't random acts of vandalism. They are fueled by a deep hatred for anyone perceived as being on the wrong side of the political aisle. The messages left behind are not just graffiti, they are declarations of ideological warfare. Even more disturbing is the weaponization of law enforcement through swatting incidents targeting Trump supporters. These are not pranks. They are calculated attempts to terrorize and intimidate, putting innocent lives at risk. The misuse of emergency services in this manner is not only dangerous, but also a gross abuse of public resources. Families are left in fear, their homes invaded by heavily armed officers responding to false reports. The psychological trauma inflicted by such incidents is immeasurable, leaving scars that may never fully heal. The perpetrators know the potential consequences, yet they act with impunity, emboldened by a belief that their actions are justified in the name of social justice. This twisted sense of righteousness allows them to rationalize their behavior, no matter how destructive or harmful it may be. This is not the America we know. This is not the America that stands as a beacon of freedom and liberty. This is not the future we want for our children. We envision a country where they can grow up in safety, free from the fear of violence and retribution for their beliefs or the choices they make. We must stand up and condemn these acts of violence before it's too late. Our voices must be loud and clear, rejecting the notion that violence is an acceptable means of political expression. Silence is complicity, and we cannot afford to be complicit in the destruction of our nation. We must come together as one people to uphold the values that define us and to protect the future of our great country. Only by standing united can we hope to overcome the challenges we face and build a better, more just society for all. Attorney General Pam Bondi has bravely called attention to the escalating attacks on conservatives, recognizing them for what they are: politically motivated acts of intimidation. This is the very definition of terrorism. Similarly, Kash Patel, the new director of the FBI, has been vocal in denouncing the dangerous trend of swatting, highlighting the real and present danger it poses to innocent Americans. Swatting, a malicious act of making false emergency calls to provoke a heavy police response, has become a tool of harassment and intimidation. This type of political violence needs to stop. This is not bringing anyone to your cause. All these attacks do is further alienate your fellow Americans. As a nation, we are starting to recognize that this is not about left versus right. It's about right versus wrong. It's about standing up for the principles that define us as a society and refusing to let those principles be eroded by violence and hatred. It's about preserving the very fabric of our society, a society built on the principles of free speech, civil discourse, and the rule of law. These principles are the bedrock of our society, and they must be defended at all costs. In a world where misinformation and propaganda are rampant, the truth can often be hard to find. Truth is worth fighting for, and that we all have a role to play in ensuring that it prevails. Unfortunately, this surge in left-wing violence is not a new phenomenon. It is a dark thread woven into the fabric of our nation's history, reappearing time and again in various forms and under different banners. Each era brings its own set of challenges and grievances, but the underlying currents of radicalism and extremism remain disturbingly consistent. It is a recurring pattern in American history, with its roots in radical ideologies that prioritize ideology over human life. These movements often start with a seemingly noble cause, rallying people around issues of social justice, economic inequality, or political reform. However, as the rhetoric intensifies, the line between peaceful protest and violent action becomes increasingly blurred. The weather underground of the 1960s and 70s serves as a chilling example, engaging in bombings and robberies in their misguided quest to overthrow the government. Their actions were driven by a belief that violence was a necessary tool to achieve their revolutionary goals. This group, born out of the anti-Vietnam War movement and socialist ideologies, quickly escalated from peaceful protests to acts of domestic terrorism, leaving a legacy of fear and destruction. More recently, the 2020 riots, sparked by grievances over perceived racial injustice, were quickly hijacked by extremist elements. What began as peaceful demonstrations calling for an end to systemic racism and police brutality soon devolved into chaos. Opportunistic agitators exploited the situation, turning protests into battlegrounds and overshadowing the original message of the movement. Businesses were burned, livelihoods destroyed, and innocent people were injured or killed. The economic impact was devastating, with countless small businesses, many of them minority-owned, suffering irreparable damage. The human toll was equally tragic, as communities already struggling with poverty and inequality were further destabilized by the violence. These acts of violence, often excused or minimized by those who should have condemned them, left a trail of devastation in their wake. Political leaders and media figures, instead of unequivocally denouncing the violence, sometimes offered tacit approval or downplayed the severity of the situation. We all remember the news broadcast of mostly peaceful protests while buildings were burning in the background. These historical events serve as stark reminders of the dangers of unchecked extremism. They highlight the fragile nature of social order and the ease with which it can be disrupted by those willing to use violence to achieve their ends. The lessons of the past are clear. When radical ideologies are allowed to fester and grow unchecked, the consequences are catastrophic. They demonstrate the slippery slope from radical rhetoric to violent action. What starts as impassioned speeches and fervent debates often quickly escalate into physical confrontations and acts of terror. The transition from words to deeds is often swift and unpredictable, catching society off guard and unprepared for the ensuing chaos. We must learn from these tragedies and resolve to prevent them from happening again. This requires a collective effort from all sectors of society, including government, community leaders, and ordinary citizens. By standing together against violence and extremism, we can honor the memory of those who have suffered and build a future where such horrors are a thing of the past. What is perhaps most concerning is the mainstream media's complicity in this growing crisis. Instead of objectively reporting on these acts of violence, many outlets downplay, ignore, or even justify them. They create a false narrative, portraying the perpetrators as victims and the victims as aggressors. This blatant double standard only serves to embolden the violent left while silencing their victims. This biased coverage is not just irresponsible, it's dangerous. It creates a climate of fear and intimidation, where people are afraid to express their views for fear of reprisal. It undermines the very foundations of a free and open society, where dissenting voices are not just tolerated but valued. The American people deserve better. They deserve a media that is committed to truth and objectivity, not to pushing a political agenda. They deserve a media that holds all sides accountable regardless of their political affiliation. Until we have that, the cycle of violence will continue. Pause 2S. In conclusion, this is not a new thing in America. The left has a very colorful history when it comes to using violence to try and push their agenda. Just look back a few years. During the mostly peaceful protests of 2020, they burned down large sections of cities across the country, attacked a federal courthouse in Portland for over 120 straight days, and killed at least 32 innocent people. If you want to go back further, look to the late 60s and 1970s. The Weather Underground, an offshoot of the Students for a Democratic Society, led a terror campaign that lasted for several years, setting over 2,000 bombs targeting buildings including banks, police stations, private homes, federal buildings, and even the Pentagon. I often see the Democrats and the media decrying the right for violence. This is nothing more than an unhinged rant from an uneducated, idiotic leftist trying to gain points with their uneducated base of voters. If the right was actually the problem, you would know it. The right owns more firearms than the military, and most have been through extensive training, if not actual combat. We just want to be left alone. The problem is the left just can't do that. They just keep poking the bear. Let me make a suggestion. Leave us alone, or you risk waking up parts of us we have tried real hard to keep hidden. Stay frosty, my friends. Keep your head down and your powder dry.